Mike, I don't sound any louder. That's for the video camera. Our speaker today, as you can see, is Gene Kim. He's the Chief Technical Officer for Tripwire. For those of you who are not familiar with the history of this, I'll give you a few words of introduction. A number of years ago, when I was much younger, faculty member, I was approached by an undergraduate student who was looking for a project. And I had gotten glowing recommendations from, about this student from people who had encountered him other places, said how imaginative and inventive this person was, and what a real find, and I should get him involved in some of my research. And I did. But that's a different story. Let me tell you about Gene. Gene was looking for something else to do other than classwork, and I had been coping with some break-ins to systems on campus at the time where the intruder had been altering system files and libraries to provide backdoors into the system, and had been changing the modification times on the files and changing the checksums, so it wasn't possible to tell what had happened using any of the standard tools we had available. And this series of break-ins has since been documented in a book called At Large by Mann and Friedman, and if you haven't read the book, it's an interesting read. But we were looking for some mechanism that we could use to determine what had been changed on a system and to alert us when a break-in had occurred. So I had played around a little bit with the design, but it needed some validation. And so Gene was the perfect patsy, experimenter to come along at the time. And so I gave the project to him. And over the next year and a half, 2 years,
3 incompletes.
And 3 incompletes. Actually, I think it was only 2, but nonetheless, Gene did a marvelous job of testing this, of building up the algorithms, doing some of the research, doing a lot of software engineering, messing up systems at Puck that got him in trouble, but those got fixed, and turned it into the Tripwire tool, which was eventually released and is, by some accounts, still the most widely used security tool in the world today. So we're very pleased when Gene agreed to come back and to give this seminar. Tripwire Security Systems is the company that's now commercialized this and is building a number of other very interesting products. He's going to talk to us about some of the experiences with Tripwire. And he still has a lot of the characteristics of when he was a student, because last night we went to pick him up at the airport and the plane arrived at 7:30. It was 2 degrees outside. Gene had no coat, no gloves, no hat, did have a sweater, and his comment was, is it cold here? Do I need the sweater? So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Memory himself, Gene Kim.
All right. See, this seems hardly fair because I remember giving a paper at the Application Developer Conference. It must have been '92, and I remember actually thinking ahead a little bit and trying to think about how to pack. And on the website it said, 15 degrees, and this was in Toronto, Canada. So I remember getting off the plane with, a suitcase full of sweaters and jackets, and it turns out it was 15 degrees Celsius, not 15 degrees Fahrenheit. So I just can't get it right. I was trying to think of some interesting things to talk about for this presentation, and I think the timing is actually very, very good. We're actually going through some interesting thought processes at Tripwire involving open source, Linux. Hey, Gene. And a lot of it has been a significant departure from the thinking that has built the company from essentially 2 people to 70 people now. So I'm going to walk you through Tripwire history and tell you about some of our expectations going in, some of the successes, and also some of the things that we didn't quite expect. And some of them were actually quite bizarre. One of the issues that we're starting to grapple with is this notion of open source, the cathedral versus bazaar that Eric Raymond put forth. And I'm going to try to give you some of the data points that we've gathered the last 8 years and see if that alters your opinions about the cathedral versus the bazaar. So I'm going to talk about some open source opportunities and risks that we see. And listen, in some of these things, I'm trying to state some opinions. If you have any counter opinions, please write them down. And actually, I'd like to leave enough space at the end so we can actually have an open forum about this. So that would be the last slide discussion. I have a couple slides about Tripwire for those of you who aren't familiar with the tool. It was originally released in 1992 on the 5th anniversary of the Morris Internet Worm incident. It was written by myself and Gene Spafford, and over the last 8 years it's become widely used and widely deployed. A good indication of that is that you go to the CERT webpage, and part of the series of best practices that they recommend is backing up, installing security patches, and running Tripwire. Good way of describing what Tripwire does is that it monitors files for unauthorized changes. So files change all the time, but certain files change in only very specific ways. For example, system files shouldn't change except for when you meaningfully do it by installing security patches. Log files change all the time, but they only change in very specific ways. Specifically, you expect them to grow. If you find your log files shrinking or vanishing, that's something you want to know about. So essentially, Tripwire will build a baseline database and scan a file system for unauthorized changes. We originally designed it for intrusion detection. We say that because one of the classic MOs of an attacker is that they will break into the system somehow and then plant backdoors. Most intrusion detection tools are based on known attacks, and because we're integrity based, we detect attacks regardless of how they are made. The application that most of our customers get the most benefit from is what we're calling damage assessment recovery. In the case that there's been a break-in, often you have a data center manager or a system administrator whose job is to get that server up. Now the industry lingo is 5 nines, 99.999% uptime. That's 37 seconds of allowed downtime per month. That makes each second very precious. So the ability to quickly determine what the scope of damage is and be able to get a list of tampered files is basically a to-do list for recovery. So if it saves them having to investigate and diagnose, then that's very, very valuable. Forensics, there's a notion of a camera at a crime scene. And if you think about a Tripwire database, it's essentially a snapshot of a file system. So there are many uses where it's very nice to have a very specific but compact snapshot of a computer file system, and Tripwire plays that role well. Policy conformance is interesting. We were able to tap a lot of Y2K budgets last year. The motivation is that you have a lot of critical business processes that run on all sorts of machines. Some of them that these mainframes that someone hasn't even touched in say years and years and years, and yet they have to be able to certify that each machine or each server that the business's processes run on are going to behave predictably when the clock struck January 1. So often the end result was the placement of a blue sticker that says, "Hi, I'm Y2K ready," which was only put on the machine after the machine was thoroughly audited, where they made sure that the underlying platform and software packages were Y2K certified. The problem is, how do you know if someone hasn't changed the machine after the blue sticker goes on the box? So they use Tripwire to lock down and enforce the Y2K lockdown. A brief timeline of Tripwire releases. It was originally released in 1992. In June of '98, we obtained the Tripwire license from Purdue University as Tripwire security systems. We renamed the product that we worked on at Purdue the academic source release. Our intent was to make it not free and to somehow denigrate it just a little bit so we could position the commercial product as the better one, and yet somehow not damage the Tripwire name. In January '99, we shipped our first commercial product, which we wrote from the ground up to give it some legs to take us where we thought we wanted to take the company. In April 99, we shipped a version for Windows NT. And last month, we re-released all the versions to basically give the roadmap for Tech, which is the Tripwire Enterprise Control Manager, and I'll show some screenshots of that. But so as of now, we support something like 8 different Unix platforms in Windows NT, and we're now shipping a centralized reporting and control manager. You know, to give you an idea of where we've invested our efforts is ease of management, ease of reporting, ease of installation. You know, one of the biggest, I would say, risks of running Tripwire, one of the biggest problems of, with running Tripwire is that you had to store all your critical files on read-only media, you know, to prevent an attacker from breaking into the system and then tampering with the underlying snapshot or the policy files. There was a well-publicized, well, there was a known attack on an ISP, it was Route 66, where someone had used some well-known exploit, you know, got the root prompt, you know, planted the rootkits, the backdoors, and you know, then proceeded to type vi etc db tripwire, and you know, change the database file to match the tampered files. So the system administrators got a false sense of security that everything was okay just because Tripwire said it was okay, despite all the banners and the README and the documentation, Usenet postings. You know, they still forgot to put the critical files on, say, a CD-ROM or on a floppy. So that was a risk, and we now mitigate that by allowing you to cryptographically sign these critical files, so you can get some sense of security that no one can tamper without the files. They have to have the secret. Configuration files, you can now modify. You know, before you would have to change a header file to change the way certain configuration settings. Now it's in a say like a windows.ini file as opposed to having to recompile. Where else we invested effort was making it so Tripwire could do more report interpretation as opposed to the system administrator. So we enhanced the policy language so you could annotate these rule sets with things like owners, severity, person to be notified by email in the case of a violation. So it matches the way an IS department typically works. So you don't have the, say, system administrator being paged at 2 a.m. because the webmaster changed a file. You can actually delegate certain areas of responsibility based on where it lives in the file system. And we emphasized the incident handling use case. In other words, that person who is ultimately accountable and responsible for getting a server back up, we drilled down and made sure that this person had the tools by looking at Tripwire report to actually get the server back up. Ease of installation, you don't need to compile anything. So, there's also various internal things that we did to allow us to get some leverage going forward. One is we want to make sure that everything we did sort of took us forward. Customers, we had a 300,000 active user customers. All of them wanted everything now. It was very important for us to architect things in a way that we made monotonic progress forward, and we're able to put out releases without having to re-engineer anything. Another sort of value is that because for certain customers, say an online stock trading site, they demand 15-minute response time. It definitely pays off to keep this in mind that you may have a critical bug to leave enough hooks for instrumentation so we can quickly diagnose what's going on, because there are it's our sort of reputation on the line. To give you an idea of where we're going, I mean, this is the Tripwire Tech console, the Enterprise Control Manager. This is sort of like the centralized dashboard that we're providing. So, for us, we've been beaten up by our customers all year long, saying, it's hard for us to deploy more than, 50, 100 Tripwire, agents out there without some way of being able to monitor, control, administer, and manage, these servers from a central location. And so this remedies that. And that'll be shipping in the next couple of months. That's certainly one aspect. Another aspect is that we're providing centralized reporting capabilities. So you can actually, we're providing a level of report interpretation that simply didn't exist before. We're doing more than just populating tree control. We're using the severity information, the all this information that you're encoding in the policy language, to leverage when it's actually time to read a report. I remember the 37 seconds you can use up very quickly. So we want to make sure that we provide scope of damage and what the road to recovery is very, very quickly. So this has gone relatively well. I mean, one of the problems, well, I mean, certainly a very good thing is that Tripwire had a good reputation, over the 6 years prior to us taking control of the intellectual property and the name. Tripwire had inherited or earned a good reputation as a reliable tool. And we saw this because it was being taught in security courses. It's mentioned in a lot of books. That also was a problem for us because our existing, or what was going to be our paying customer base, may have expectations so high that the difference between what they expect and what we delivered, created a gap, and that would lead to disappointment. But our first test visits were extremely validating, and the feedback that we've gotten very strongly is that they were easy to deploy, easy to integrate into business processes. Often security, especially in the IT area, is just a technology to support business processes. It's not that they think security is interesting in and of itself. It's because they want to mitigate certain risks, and they found that it's easy to get Tripwire to protect those critical processes. And an unexpected, something that came out stronger than what we had expected was that our customers are finding that the existing security staff, say the security infosec people, are finding that Tripwire gives them a force multiplier. That once you have the to-do list, you can actually farm that out to every available system administrator. You don't have to have security expertise to contribute to an outage caused by a security incident. So that's very good. By all definitions, we would consider that a success. We sold 7 figures worth of revenue of the Tripwire product last year. We're projecting 8 figures of revenue this year. We're 70 people and growing. We've doubled consistently in size every 4.5 months for the last 32 months. Something about that math doesn't work quite right, but I think certainly in the last 16 months. So goals this year, get Tripwire deployed as far as we can, and have Tripwire become a part of the infrastructure of business processes. Where are we going? Well, right now, what Tripwire does very well is answer the question, is my server the same as yesterday? Right? And the reason that's so important is that if you take a look at even, say, a firewall, you invest man weeks, man months, getting this thing exactly right, and then you deploy it. And then you leave it alone, sort of like a router. You really don't know if it's the same as yesterday. What you need is a certain confidence that it's exactly the same as when you deployed it. So we want to expand that to not just servers or firewalls running on Unix systems. We want to protect everything that critical business processes run on. So we're building Tripwire for routers. We're building Tripwire for databases. We're considering, say, Tripwire for networks. It would be interesting if you knew you could run some sort of program that said, oh, do you know a machine has disappeared or has been added, or if the port settings have been changed. What you want to know is that you want instrumentation and you want visibility, and you want to answer the question, is it the same as yesterday? If not, who did it? If it's not one of us, what did they do? We certainly want to dominate the technology of integrity. Is it the same as yesterday? Where do we go next? I believe it's going to be, is it correct? Right? Just because it's the same as yesterday doesn't tell you that it's actually correct. So, sort of leading up to the problems and opportunities and issues around open source, I've grouped the way we're going to allocate resources for the next, say, 12 months into, say, an in-the-box strategy and out-the-box strategy. The inside-the-box strategy is based, some of this problems comes from the Innovator's Dilemma book that I just gave to SPAF, is that, the classic way that standard product life cycles go is that you end up trying to serve the same customer and deliver higher and higher margins to those customers. And we're certainly going to do that. Certainly, basically those expensive items that are in the data centers that, say, In the case of a stock trading site, there are 1,000 servers in their data center. There were 500 last year. There are going to be 4,000 at the end of this year. So we want to ride that curve. But what consistently happens is that if you ignore other emerging markets, you end up missing opportunities or being vanquished by those technologies. In fact, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but in the book Innovator's Dilemma, they mentioned that in the last 25 years, there's been something like a 95% fatality rate in disk drive vendors. That the 14-inch drive manufacturers were clobbered by the 8-inch drive manufacturers, which were in turn had their lunches eaten by the 5¼ inch disk manufacturers, who should have seen the 3.5 disk manufacturers coming, but yet somehow lost to the 3.5 disk manufacturers. And yet HP tried to jump the curve and build 1.3-inch drives, but yet the market never emerged and they failed too. So it's a very interesting phenomena that I don't think people have a very good understanding of yet. So let's talk about some facts and see how this affects our strategy. One is that there are a large number of Tripwire ASR customers that cannot or will not buy Tripwire. Another fact is that there are probably 300,000 people still happily using the free version. We're hosting off our website. You can download it. But if they're happy with it, how can we get their mind share? And probably the worst part is by us shipping a closed source solution, we actually alienate some users. We have some people. I would say 1 out of 50 people that I run into, say at conferences or when I do talks, take me aside, or they raise their hand and say, "Why did you go closed source?" And they proceed to go on about the inherent superiority of the open source model. So until just recently, this is something I really didn't want to engage someone in. What I really wanted to know was, what is the opportunity? Until recently. I'll tell you right now, the way we're treating Linux has some serious flaws. We did try to sell the Linux product. Our products right now sell for $495. No one bought it. So we spent a considerable amount of money, resources, shipping that we could have otherwise worked on some other platform. So if we can't sell it, we thought, well, maybe the comparatively advantageous thing to do is give it away. But it still costs money to develop and test. So problems that we're having with this strategy is that we still make some people mad. Just because we give it away for free, they're saying, "My God, you're now somewhat evil, or at least more evil than you were when source code was available." And this is a bit of a problem because one of the things that was so nice about Tripwire is that it had almost universal goodwill. And somehow us shipping a better version of it, but not releasing source code, has now generated some ill will. There's actually a more serious problem that we ran into when, with a switch from the libc to the glibc. I made the decision to ship a Linux product using the glibc 2.1 in violation of the GNU the GPL, the GNU Public License. Thank you. And the rationale was that the exposure was very small. That we were working on ways to get in compliance, but really the risk is maybe some bad publicity. I didn't see much downside exposure, but we did get caught. It's not a big deal, but clearly it's not. This current strategy is not going to work. So all in all, this is for me pretty awful. We take all this effort to ship a Linux product, and all we do is make people mad. Interesting data point, though, is that this Linux download is now outnumbering the ASR downloads by something like 20 to 1. So that's interesting. If they think open source is so great, why aren't they downloading the old version? But that's an intellectual argument, not an emotional argument. So the challenge is to somehow take part or appease or satisfy the open source community without sort of destroying something that's working pretty well, right? And we're projecting great revenue, and customers are very happy with us, and we think we can build a real business around this. Should we do what some other security companies have done, which is basically withdraw from the Linux market, saying it's not worth our effort, there's no return on the investment that we're making? Or maybe we can actually turn this challenge into an opportunity, and that's something that I'd like to walk through today. Something that this challenge has forced me to do is start investigating the cathedral and the bazaar arguments. In my view, it's not necessarily a closed source versus open source argument. The claim that you hear so often, and in fact from some very intelligent people, is that open source is an inherently better way to write software. Open source is inherently a better way, yeah. And to be honest, I don't think that's necessarily true. I'm going to present some facts that I've gathered over the last 8 years in relationship to Tripwire and show how that is somewhat contrary to some of the claims that the open source people say. I think the reality is not necessarily whether you release source code or not, but the closed versus open model is a different way of control of content, ideas, and people. One of the reasons why I like the cathedral is that you can control who gets to play in the cathedral. In fact, maybe that's just a generous way of saying the problem with the bazaar is that you can't keep the people out of the bazaar. In the book Code Complete, Steve McConnell says that the top % of coders are 10 times more productive than the average coder. In other words, if you take a look at their productivity, if you take a look at the number of lines of code they contribute to a project, the difference between the good ones and the bad ones are something like 10x. In some cases, I've even seen this vary as much as 100x. What's it saying that even in the skilled workforce, your top 10% are performing far more efficiently than the rest of the organization. And that's among the qualified workers. Another sort of characteristic of cathedrals is that they will invest heavily in raising the average skill level. One of the hard things about working with the bazaar is that you don't have that leverage. I'm going to claim, or at least propose somewhat facetiously, that maybe bazaar attendees tend to have low skill. Yet, there are some successes with, the bazaar. I actually posted this to the intrusion detection list, based sort of as an addition to a story that Spaff and I published probably 6 years ago. One of the things that amazes me about open source projects is that you can have any expectation of support. One person posts to, say, alt.security saying, why isn't Tripwire ported to the Kumquat Mark IV? And for some odd reason, I felt compelled to reply back. And if you think about it, this is a very odd thing. That's like someone walking into a grocery store with some complaints about the way Charmin works and screaming out in the middle of the grocery aisle, who invented Charmin? I demand to speak. Whoever invented Charmin, I've got, I want to know what kind of trees you use, and I've got 18 brilliant ideas that I want to keep secret, that I want to tell you, if you deserve it. And sort of the reality of the internet and open source is that people not only tolerate this behavior, they support them and encourage them, and even if they feel they're worthy, will take you to the inventor Charmin. So instead of everyone sort of ignoring this obnoxious, crass person, you'll find one person saying, "Oh, Gene's home phone number is blah blah blah." You have another person, offering to take notes and email me the note, and you have another. Sometimes you'll even have Bob, the inventor of Charmin, coming out from behind the fruit stand and actually conversing them and engaging them in dialogue. So in my view, that's a rather surprising set of circumstances. You wouldn't expect that, say, if you had a complaint about Charmin, that you could walk into the grocery store and be able to make a lot of progress in airing your complaints. So, how does this relate to Tripwire? I think Tripwire is interesting because it's been around for 8 years, and it has offered enough or ample time to gather some interesting statistics. I would say there's been 10 contributors who have invested or invested some energy in significant source code attribution, and they are attributed in the README. But even then, the kind of scope is on the order of like tens of lines, maybe in the case of Matt Bishop, hundreds of lines. In the case of Rich Sauls, good Lord, I mean, he sent me not only revisions but also source code reviews and suggestions, which is very nice. But they represent by far the vast minority. We estimate there's probably upwards of 1 million downloads of Tripwire in the last 8 years. So if you take 10 of that, that's actually a very small percentage. Maybe another more interesting statistic is that there have been numerous, maybe tens, maybe 50s of contributors who sent in revisions, and you take a look at them and you very politely say thanks but no thanks. I'll file that away and maybe I'll put it in. This is sort of they fall into the category of my good Lord, they're not even wrong. They're you don't even know what they're doing. They took all the vowels out. Why would I want to do that? But on the other hand, we think there are tens, or we claim about 150 to 300,000 active users. So that's kind of interesting, right? 1 million downloads, 150,000 users, 50 source code contributors who we reject, and 10 that we accept. So if there's an claim that comes from the open source community that you can leverage the expertise of thousands and thousands of qualified developers, that resource probably hasn't been tapped by the Tripwire projects. So I think it's safe to say that when you make a source code tree public, source code doesn't magically fix itself. Source code doesn't magically write itself. Help? What? Magically? Magically is spelled wrong? Magically does not fix. Fix itself. Thank you. Very good. Okay, big surprise. You post source code on the web page, and nothing really magically spontaneously happens. It doesn't get better just by sitting there, nor does it grow just by sitting there. There's a book called Net Gain that actually gives some interesting terminology. He uses it to describe community building, like portal sites or discussion groups. You have the browsers, users, and builders, and he actually tries to apply what some amount of monetary worth per each category. But I think by the time you go from the browsers to users to builders, you lose orders of magnitude. You find if you go by the Tripwire numbers, the number of builders is many, many, many orders of magnitude smaller than the number of users or browsers. This is so sorry. I don't know how. All right, let me try to point out some. I pulled these numbers out while I was on a plane. God, I wish. Does anyone know how to change colors in PowerPoint?
Was that by any chance one of the stealth planes?
Yeah. I think this is interesting. Trouble is, it's in the table. Well, this will do. Yeah. It's like this Word object. There we go. Look at that. It's actually Microsoft Word running inside of PowerPoint as an ActiveX control. Okay. I think this is kind of interesting. Let me walk you through the interpretation. I tried to compute what the total cost of manufacturing was for the free version, the first commercial version, and the Windows NT version. So in here you have here you have how many operating systems were supported. So 56 plus was for the free version. How many lines of code, what the estimated cost was, and sort of the cost per line of code. So let's go through the 2.0 version. We supported 2 operating systems, Linux and Solaris. It was about 80,000 lines of code. Why? Well, I think as a sort of way of scaling with the number of developers, you end up breaking things up and you introduce some inefficiency there for the trade-off of integration. So that's not necessarily bad. The total cost is something like about $500,000, and the number of the cost per line is like about $5 per line. This is all very, very rough. I could be off by an order of magnitude, but it's interesting to see these numbers. For the NT product, one operating system, it ended up being 130,000 lines of code, including research of trying to figure out, oh my God, what is NTFS, and trying to figure out how to, and it was just like this never-ending thing. Anyway, basically, I think 200,000 was the cost to research it, and anyway, total implementation cost is over $750,000. Average cost per, cost per line was something like $6 per line. All right, let's go to the 1.2. 12,000 lines of code. About $156,000 in development costs if you, if you used, would consider compensating me or staff for my time using, what I call industry rates. And then here's the cost per line of code. So it seems lower than the commercial efforts. However, if you add, the 100 testers, that took part of the beta process, and compensated them at something like $75 an hour, then all of a sudden that you elevate the cost here, and you end up with a very similar number with the 2.0 project. So it seems to me that if you buy these numbers, that the cost of producing software, whether it was the open source by slave labor, indentured servitude, and staff's fear of me ruining his reputation by shipping crappy software, and the voluntary efforts that actually do have some value of the community at large, the cost is very comparable to what we do when we build internally. So I would say it's not, open source efforts are not necessarily inherently advantageous in terms of cost. And since we, one of my previous claims is that the contributions from the community at large were actually very small, I don't think that changes the picture very much at all. Some more, now here's where the presentation sort of breaks down. I'm just going to start tossing you factoids and possible interpretations. One of the things that's interesting about Tripwire is that it didn't really magically evolve. Like say, well, say like Perl. Perl has probably progressed. It's maybe even there's some projects out there whose owners have changed. And passed around. That hasn't happened with Tripwire. One of the indications is that there were a lot of sort of unanswered Usenet postings. There weren't any yearly patches. In fact, one of the things that I think hurt us is that it became increasingly difficult to compile under Linux. Talk about that later. So that's kind of interesting, right? Without active intervention or willful act of creation, open source projects can tail off and become quiescent. But if that's true, and there's a need out there that gets created as a result, or a need that's unfilled, these vacuums tend to get filled. There's this project called AID out of Finland. Mtree, they do similar things to Tripwire. I think that part of that is a result of the perception of ceased development in Tripwire. Maybe one of the sort of hypotheses or claims that I might make is that maybe the skill level of the bazaar is lower than we had possibly thought, even feasible. I think it is hard enough to build software in the cathedral. Spaff has this great saying, one of the challenges of writing security software is it's sort of like building planes when not every one of the people working on it is a pilot. I think that's a very interesting challenge. I mean, that means that to get scalability in the software development process, you need to be able to leverage, someone's expertise. I think that maybe one of the reasons why we didn't get spontaneous participation in source code development for Tripwire is that it's even harder to build airplanes when the average skill level of participants is low. good reasons to believe that this is true is that the labor market in this economy is unprecedentedly tight. There's lots of turnover in system administration time. People's day is busy enough sort of working on the day job. There's not a lot of spare cycles to work on volunteer projects. Perhaps that's another reason. I think the effect of having such a booming economy is that that competes with the amount of free time, leisure time that open source projects would benefit from. Perhaps that's the reason. But this has a terrible title. It's hard to reconcile that with the college and university environment. If you take a look at all of the open source projects that have been incredibly successful, there's certainly a lot of those. But let me suggest, and I wish if I somehow got this slide clobbered, that if you take a look at where these efforts are being invested in, it's things like MP players, MP3 players, like Winamp. It's going to be things like Xtank or MUDs, and I think there's some very real truth to that. And I think that also matches where you find the most available amount of leisure time, not leisure time, idle cycles that could be otherwise used. If you take a look at, so I'll say what I did. I certainly was busy with schoolwork. At one point, I was taking 21 hours plus graduate courses. I still really would rather have been working on Tripwire. I can imagine now. I certainly saw many of my friends, spend 60 plus hours writing multi-user dungeon games. Saw others working on Xtank. I would imagine the equivalent now is working on the latest, greatest MP3 player, encoder, what have you. So I think there is real merit to this notion that open source projects can be a real success, but it's probably more of a phenomena of where you find people with talent and skill and otherwise available idle cycles. I want to talk a little bit about life cycles. You'll find in commercial products, the way projects get launched and products get built is that you have to sort of identify or identify an opportunity. You're basically saying we think that there's an opportunity here, and then you're going to justify that and then codify that, and then you're going to commit to it, and you're going to basically spend money on trying to sell it. Open source projects really don't have that kind of discipline and resource allocation. Instead, you end up with the fire aim effect, as Guy Kawasaki would say in Rules for Revolutionaries. Or they just do it because it's fun, right? I didn't. Well, in the case of Tripwire, I did it because I had to. But if in the case of, say, your MP3 contributor, they're doing it because they want to, and for them, there's no resource allocation process to enforce certain disciplines. It's just because they enjoy doing it. One of the things that came out of the Innovator's Dilemma book is this notion of a disruptive product life cycle. He's saying in this book, the way to become one of the 5.25-inch disc manufacturers trying to compete with an 8-inch disc manufacturer is trying to duplicate some of the methodologies found in the open source projects. You ship something on a shoestring, but allow enough budget to improve as data comes in. Don't guess where the market is. Don't try to justify it. Instead, ship something that works and then improve it. And so, yeah, exactly.
Microsoft's market.
Right, but the first
That's their life cycle.
was shipped and left.
Yeah, if you look at Guy Kawasaki's book, there's a table that's just astounding. I mean, it shows basically every release of Windows and shows the additional feature set that's included by each one, and basically parallels that with the Macintosh OS. So the Macintosh OS is actually pretty short and sporadic, reflecting increased investment and sort of oscillation. Whereas with Microsoft, they just kept plugging away, and something like 12 years later, they had a stable OS.
When was that?
Right. Well, let's not be mean. Interesting other factoids. Forrester Research estimates that 25% of all enterprise mission-critical servers will be Linux within the next 5 years. Let me explain some of these bullets. So written these when I was sleepy. Move these 2 red bullets underneath here. Let me claim that users of Linux are almost by definition system administrators. They have some system administration skill. I know this to be a fact because I recently put up well, not recently, last year, I turned one of my PCs into a firewall. And it took me like 2 freaking days. Right? I was actually reading through manuals, doing things that I've never done before, screaming in frustration, started over, the whole deal. So I would claim that in order to successfully use a Linux box, you have to have some degree of system administration skill. What's interesting about that is that a lot of these folks will, if they're not a part of industry already, will become a part of industry. And if there's some way that we can earn their goodwill as Tripwire, then we benefit not necessarily now, but certainly when they enter industry and maybe become a part of purchasing processes.
But by the same logic, users of Windows and Mac OS are all by definition system administrators as well. Because, they're doing the same things. If you talk about home users of Linux, yes, you're right. You say most of them are.
Yeah, I'm talking about hobbyists.
However,
Talking about by choice.
it's by choice.
That's by choice, right, the hobbyists.
But if you're talking about commercial users of either of those, and it doesn't necessarily fall through, I'd say commercial users of Linux are mostly not system administrators because they're using it for things like firewalls.
Right. Maybe I would.
Everyone's a user, or print servers where it's cheap, a cheap print server.
I'm trying to motivate open source. You want that? I would say that what
I'm
you're.
saying that the analogy's mismatched.
Maybe the analogy is the same as most consumers of cars are not necessarily mechanically inclined, but race car hobbyists are.
You said by choice.
By choice, right? By choice. All right. Well, here's some kind of interesting, carrots for open source. One of the things that we may, Linux version of Tripwire might be free, but we still can't ship on a lot of these Linux operating systems because we're not open source. Well, maybe that's interesting because, one of the things that Spaff and I mentioned in our papers 8 years ago is that isn't it odd that integrity isn't a function of the operating system by default. There's another thing that I guess in the interest of time I'm not going to mention right now or not much detail, but I think there's an opportunity for in an open source Tripwire that we can grow a market for some other type of model. You can imagine, say, suppose Tripwire could serve an in case of emergency break glass. Well, then the more widely you disseminate Tripwire with operating systems, we don't even need to know where the opportunities are. They will find us. Another thing is that if we ship on the operating system, we can be a part of the build process, which gives us the ability to get something that's very interesting indeed, which is what should the files on the OS CD look like, or rather, say what should the file look like in the first place. OS vendor can't tell you. Maybe we can. Wouldn't it be interesting to create the equivalent of CDDB, an exhaustive database of all known good files? And I think this is a good place to get those signatures is through the open source community. Open source risks. To be honest, I tried to spend a lot of time trying to paint risks, but I actually was kind of surprised myself by not being able to think of a lot of them. I'd be interested in hearing some comments, suggestions for this slide. One I can certainly imagine is that with the availability of source code, there is the possibility that someone finds a vulnerability but chooses not to report it, and they will use it to undermine Tripwire, people using Tripwire out in corporate America and government, etc. Certainly a very real one is that by giving things away for free, it may reduce the perceived value of the commercial versions that we're shipping. That's certainly one of the things that we fear. What else? I'm very interested.
Yeah, you may lose control, or somebody might modify them.
No, that's absolutely a good one. In fact, I'm hoping that with the right selection of a license agreement, you can actually mitigate that. But I'd be interested in talking about that. Well, okay, so that was a very long, meandering way of getting to here. Open source involves a lot of fear, although one can learn to embrace it. I'm not committing to anything right now, but it's certainly been an interesting thought process. One thing of the things that's very clear is that there aren't very many successful models to follow in terms of control of source code. You mentioned something very interesting. Netscape tried to do it, but when you look at the Netscape's timing, I perceive that as a move of desperation. Right? They were getting pasted by Internet Explorer, and then they said, "Oh my God, where are those 1,000 magical programmers? Publish the source code," and nothing really happened. Right? There's SendMail, there's other sorts of efforts, but all of them were either, I would say, unsuccessful or too new to really gather any data from. On the other hand, I believe that there is a scenario where an open source tripwire could result in success, but I believe it has more to do about correctly setting expectations. As long as you're not releasing source code in the hopes that you're going to tap and recruit thousands of magical code elves, but you're going to try to achieve some other purpose. And one of the things, I guess the other concluding point is that I think one of the through the facts that I presented, I think a lot of the successes and inherent superiorities of open source are actually misattributed to expectation management. I don't think when Spaff and I started Tripwire that Spaff set me down and said, "All right, this is going to be the most widely deployed Unix security tool." And 8 years from now, someone's going to commercialize it. That's the bar. Well, no, the bar was, "Gene, I'm going to trade 3 credits for you if you can get this very small task done." And because expectations and success, what the measure of success was set relatively low, it actually allowed the Tripwire development to take a path of its own, and something that I would say has been very successful. That is my last slide. Questions, comments? Tom, of course. Well, let someone else talk for once.
Starting, you ponder why Tripwire wasn't embraced and things weren't done to it or suggested by the open source community. And I think I have 3 reasons at least why this didn't happen. First, in Tripwire first isn't probably perceived to be terribly sexy by the community. That's probably one reason. And there weren't really obvious parallel development paths for it. When you look at something like Linux, where you talk about getting the great horde of developers to come in, there are many parallel development paths all happening that are being merged by Linus and Alan. In that case, that develop completely different parts of the kernel. That's just one reason. And Tripwire is nowhere near that.
But on the other hand, I would say less. The paging program is not also very sexy, and yet.
True, but there are obvious performance things. You can.
Sure.
There are vanity points there, right, for making the pager much faster. Right?
By the way, one of the the number Spaff. I don't think you know this. I think the 10th beta tester of Tripwire is now the IS manager at eBay. He was employee number 60. Pretty amazing.
So those are the things I can think of that you could add to this slide.
That's good. Yeah.
Are you working on the Windows 2000 type integration, especially with regards to files that span multiple servers?
Yes. We actually handle all the Windows 2000 features like encrypted file. We check those attributes too.
Right. When you handle files that span multiple servers, even worse than multiple.
Oh, I don't know, to be honest. I really don't know. If it's.
You want the product to be a directory interface rather than.
Right. Don't know. Find out. Yeah.
One of the things that makes Tripwire a little bit less attractive to Linux users, at least to me, is only supporting Red Hat. Which, yeah, it is probably the largest single distribution, and I now understand that, you're making such losses on Red Hat, or on Linux's development. that you don't want to put more time into spreading it for other ones, but there's a lot of other Linux users.
Actually, we did switch to linking statically, and now we run on almost anything, provided some horrible kernel modification that broke the file system API. But in doing so, we also managed to, we're no longer in compliance with the GPL. You don't need to broadcast that, everybody, but it's true. And I'm committed to getting us in compliance. Actually, just for your amusement, once every 4 months, I get a mail from Mr. Smith. It's lockdown something something at hotmail.com, and it's this breathtakingly long, critique on Tripwire. And it says, it's great. I mean, someone's investing a lot of good thought. I mean, it's literally written. It's well articulated. I wish if I would rather encourage a more continuous stream of communication rather than this diuretic outpouring of things. It makes it hard to respond to. But one of the things about the internet is you really don't know who this anonymous person is, right? I mean, what is it? On the internet, no one knows you're a dog. On the internet, no one knows that you're actually the vice president of product development at Oracle. You never know, so you got to treat everybody very respectfully. Other questions? Gene.
I would think that one battle you'd be fighting is that right now the hot thing in industry, to a lesser degree government, between the traditional big three goals of security, confidentiality, integrity, and availability is really availability.
Yeah.
And I don't know what you're thinking about. Are you thinking about moving more into this kind of direction?
Yeah, actually, that is actually everything now. Not everything. That's the main benefit of integrity. I mean, it's hard to maintain 99.99% uptime when someone can crash your server at will, or it's hard to maintain that kind of uptime when. I mean, this is amazing. Like the cost, a bank gave us some network outage costs, and they estimated the cost of 6 network outages last year cost them something like $400 million. So I did some math, and it comes out to about $10 million an hour. So that's the availability. If we can chop that in half, we've just saved them $200 million.
Are you looking to RPM?
Man, you guys all know. Yes, yes, absolutely. If at some point, if we want, to create a room full of love, get the come on back, everybody. We're open source again. I think they would like RPM too. Good. I think we have time for one more question.
We can run over it.
Okay. Anything? Comments? Thank you.